Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Witness's TED Countdown event. My name is Julianne Miranda-Brobeck, and I'm the head of U.S. Communications and Global Partnerships at Global Witness. Today's event focuses on a key driver of climate change, deforestation, and the players behind it. For the past 25 years, Global Witness has investigated and exposed the drivers behind environmental devastation and human rights abuses around the world. We work tirelessly for real solutions to protect people and the planet. As we face a growing climate crisis and feel its impacts, from devastating forest fires to flooding, worsening droughts, extreme weather patterns, the time for tangible cross-cutting solutions is now. Today, Global Witness is going to take you behind the scenes to show you how we uncover environmental abuse, particularly the key drivers of the climate crisis, and what stories need to be captured to propel change. Deforestation around the world accounts for 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. If it were a country, it would rank third in carbon dioxide emissions behind China and the US. In our investigations, we've exposed how global financial institutions, some of the biggest names that we all know, are linked to massive deforestation projects around the world. Alongside this rainforest destruction are also appalling human rights abuses. Today, we are joined by a brilliant panel of investigators and campaigners from Global Witness. Please join me in welcoming them. We have Chris Moy, environmental campaigner at Global Witness, Joe Blackman, head of forest policy and advocacy at Global Witness, Leila Stanley, forests investigator at Global Witness, and Louis Goddard, data investigations advisor at Global Witness. Before we get started, please take a moment to learn more about how banks are complicit in deforestation and why we urgently need to protect our forests.
Deforestation accounts for 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. If it were a country, it would rank third in carbon dioxide emissions after China and the US. Forests are home to a significant amount of the world's biodiversity, over half of the world's species. These forest ecosystems are also vital to local people's culture, food, water, and livelihoods. Forests like the Amazon are critical to our planet's survival, yet vast areas of these forests are being burned and destroyed. Between 2001 and 2015, over 300 million hectares of tree cover was lost, an area nearly the size of Argentina. Often the destruction happens to make way for big agribusiness, to produce everyday products like beef, palm oil and rubber for faraway consumers. A decade ago, hundreds of agribusiness companies promised to stamp out deforestation by 2020. They've failed, and the climate crisis is now critical. What's more, local communities trying to save forests often experience land grabs and human rights abuses. We need to stop the money flowing to harmful agribusiness and other companies that think they can profit from the destruction of forests. What is at the heart of this catastrophic problem? Banks. Banks and investors, headquartered in London, New York, Berlin and beyond, are providing billions of dollars in financing to agribusiness companies who are in turn clearing huge areas of trees. A Global Witness investigation found that more than 300 banks and investors backed 6 of the world's most harmful agribusinesses to the tune of $44 billion from 2013 to 2019. The problem is systemic. Bank commitments to end deforestation don't seem to be working. We need governments to step up and shut down the money pipeline behind deforestation.
As you've just seen, the time for solutions to the climate crisis is now. Today, we'll take you to Papua New Guinea and Brazil, 2 countries that have been especially devastated by deforestation of climate-critical forests. We'll also be taking questions at the end, so please do input your questions into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We'll start in Papua New Guinea, where Leila Stanley, a forest investigator at Global Witness, will walk us through the situation on the ground. Leila, tell us what your investigative work in Papua New Guinea has uncovered and why this country should be on everybody's radar.
Thanks so much, Julianne. Yeah, so Papua New Guinea is one of the single most biodiverse countries on Earth. Something somewhere between 5 and 7% of all species on the planet live there. And that's partially because it also boasts part of the 3rd largest remaining rainforest on the planet. Most of the millions of Papua New Guineans rely on those forests for their livelihoods, and that includes food and shelter, medicines, cultural values. But beyond the direct ways that those forests support local people, they're also important to the entire globe in terms of carbon storage. But they're being destroyed at a frankly terrifying rate. Papua New Guinea now exports more tropical logs than any other country in the world, and those trees are being cut down in part because of a rapid expansion of unsustainable agribusiness. That industry is directly financed by banks in Southeast Asia, which are themselves backed by major global financiers. So the impact on the climate is profound, but this activity is also driving crimes against some of the people who live there. We're going to hear a little clip from Anthony, who's a villager in a part of Papua New Guinea where forests are being flattened to make way for agribusiness. First, he described for us what happened to his forests, and then told us what happened to him when he set out to document that. We're not going to name the company involved, in part for his safety.
It really changes our life. We lost most of our traditional identities, like those secret sites. It's sort of our life. It builds our own tradition, ways of living and valuing all those things. But at the moment, we lost it, so we just have empty. I can use the term empty because all those things are gone. So we cannot bring them back. They are precious in our life. We live by the nature. We always get fresh fish from the water. Now it is polluted. Chemical activities took place in the palms, fertilizers that flows down the river, and all the corals are killed. No more fish that we usually catch before. There's no more such expectation of fishing. No, especially in the bush, we usually hunt for animals and like wild pigs, and we can eat those fresh meat. But at the moment, we lost everything. From there, the police were full uniform with arms, and they all scattered around, guiding us not move around. We stay put, no shots. We're trying to get photos. They get our phones, smash it on there. So we were not informed about the arrest. There is no process. Three villages all inside. Then they move all of us inside the container. They locked us for around 5 to 6 hours. Very, very hot. Imagine the sun is very hot and the container, it's compact inside. We were crushed inside. There is no room for us to sit. We all stand still. You cannot move because 65 of us.
So Anthony and his community members were eventually released and then charged with obstructing police activity, which was a trumped up charge clearly intended to intimidate them. And this kind of violent suppression of local people by agribusiness is sadly common in Papua New Guinea. We have friends who this has happened to. Our next report, which is coming out next year, will look in detail at this kind of agribusiness and at the palm oil industry in particular and its financial backers and the impacts of that financing on communities like the one you just heard about.
Great. Thank you so much, Leela, for sharing your work with us, and quite importantly, the powerful and harrowing account of Anthony. How he and his community have suffered and the intimidation tactics used against them is absolutely heartbreaking and shocking. Safeguarding those who stand up to environmental abuse and forest destruction is critical. We're now going to hear from Chris Moy about the Amazon and Brazil in particular. Before we hear from Chris, please watch this very quick clip of what is happening in the Amazon. Chris, as we've just seen, the situation in the Amazon is dire. Based on your investigative work, could you tell us more about what is happening on the ground in Brazil, as well as what needs to happen to curb deforestation and to bring accountability?
Thanks a lot, Julianne. Most of you will know the importance of the Amazon forest for its mitigation of climate change by the massive amounts of carbon it captures, over 5% of our annual carbon emissions by some estimates. You may also know of its importance for its contribution to global water cycles, by some estimates generating over 10% of the water transpired by plants every year. And you also may know of its abundant biodiversity, containing an estimated 390 billion individual trees, 2.5 million species of insects, and 2,000 species of animals and birds. What you may know less of, however, is the Amazon's contribution to saving human life. Only one example relates to the development of an anti-malarial drugs first used by the indigenous Quechua peoples in the Amazon through a tea they drank taken from the bark of the cinchona tree, which Jesuits learned from and took to Europe. Scientists then developed these into some of the drugs we use today to treat malaria, such as amodiaquine, primaquine, and chloroquine. And this has contributed to a significant drop in malaria-related mortality, more recently declining by 50% between 2000 and 2015. Yet academics have speculated this is simply a fraction of what medicines could be discovered if we studied the forest and the knowledge developed by its indigenous guardians more. Unfortunately, all of this abundant life and potential is under threat. Over the last 20 years, Brazil has seen the highest forest loss of any country on Earth, almost 50% of which happened in the Amazon. Various academic studies have now raised the prospect of a tipping point in the Amazon, where if deforestation reaches between 20 to 40% of the total forest biome, then a vicious feedback loop will begin an irreversible conversion of what was once a dense tropical forest teeming with life, converted into a dry, lifeless savanna. But between 2004 and 2014, Brazil did manage to reduce Amazon deforestation by a massive 80%. They did this principally by expanding protected and indigenous areas that now cover 22% of the Amazon, leading to improved forest conservation. They expanded law enforcement's capacity to detect and penalize forest crime. And they restricted rural credits to rural producers that illegally deforested, while offering credit incentives for those that conserve their forests. And they invested more resources in state institutions tasked with protecting and managing the country's forests. However, under the newly elected Bolsonaro government, deforestation is rising massively again, with last year seeing the highest rate of deforestation since 2008, as they roll back forest protections and the rights of indigenous peoples, undoing all the gains made in the past, gains which, while laudable, even in and of themselves were not enough. So what are the sectors driving this destruction that we've investigated? Well, the cattle sector has historically been one of the biggest drivers of this deforestation, accounting for about 70% of the historic loss of forests in the Amazon. And as a result, there are more cows in Brazil than people, and meat from Brazil is exported all over the world, being the biggest beef exporter along with the United States. And many of you as consumers may even have eaten some of this beef. Last year, we published a report called Money to Burn that looked into this issue and investigated 3 of the biggest beef companies in Brazil and their exposure to this through the cattle they purchased from ranches that contain deforestation. We unearthed how this is simply not a problem confined to Brazil. It is a global problem involving major American and European markets whose financial giants are enabling these beef companies by the billions in financing they provide or facilitate to them. More on this later. And holding each of these actors to account for their links to Amazon destruction then becomes crucial. And our sole aim as an NGO is to expose the problems that give rise to this destruction and propose solutions, free of the issues that restrict those that profit from this industry and free of the political restrictions that limit governmental action. And we use a variety of investigative techniques to expose this deforestation, from field investigations, big data analysis, working with partners on the front lines, and cultivating credible sources over years. And these investigations can sometimes take a long time, often many years, some methods of which Julianne will introduce next. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was very, very interesting to hear. And, you know, us as consumers, as you say, around the world are likely consuming the cattle that's coming from these massive deforestation projects in Brazil. And so it really just drives home the point that we all have a role to play in the climate crisis and what's happening in different corners of the globe that might not be so close to us. So thank you so much for sharing that. As Chris said, investigations are key to uncovering environmental devastation. Global Witness investigators deploy a host of skills and techniques to uncover wrongdoing and abuse. Next, we'll hear from Louis Goddard, Data Investigations Advisor at Global Witness, who will show us just how you can uncover the extent of deforestation in Brazil.
Thanks, Julianne. Yeah, as you were saying, I mean, as Chris was saying as well, data is an increasingly important part of the sort of work we do on deforestation, particularly in this sort of era of lack of travel and travel restrictions. You know, we're sort of doing more desk-based research using satellite imagery and using deforestation data. So I'm going to show a few slides and run you through a bit of a sneak preview of some of the data that's gone into a report that we'll be publishing next month on deforestation in an Amazon state called Pará in Brazil. And this relates to cattle, as Chris was saying. So let's share my screen now. So I'm going to talk about 3 different data sources that we're using in the report. Getting a little bit of detail about each, and then I'll describe how we bring them all together and what that allows our investigators to do. So in Pará, we use 3 things. We use data on deforestation areas. That's published by the Federal Space Agency in Brazil. It's based on satellite imagery. We also use data on property boundaries. So this allows us to see where the farms are that we suspect of being involved in deforestation. And so we combine those 2 to see which farms have deforestation within them. And the final sort of piece of the puzzle is data on cattle sales. So by using this data, we can kind of get a picture of the supply chains of the big beef trading companies that we're interested in to see if they're involved in sourcing cattle from deforested areas. So to sort of go into those in order, deforestation areas, the data looks a bit like this picture on the right-hand side. So you see a sort of area of forest in Brazil, and you've got various bits where the forest has been cleared. And then these patches in red are areas of deforestation that have been detected by the Brazilian Space Agency and verified by analysts there to kind of show that, that these are sort of new areas. So each of those has a date associated with it that we can use to see when do we think this particular bit of deforestation happened. It's really good open data. It's released regularly and it's sort of updated. So it's a sort of gold standard for this kind of data in other countries across the world. Once we've got that, we combine it with the property boundaries, as I mentioned. So this kind of crazy looking image on the right shows you a whole host of rural properties in the state of Pará. This data is self-declared by farmers or ranchers. They sort of upload a file showing the extent of their property to a state register. Then any interested party can kind of search that online and get information about any particular ranch they're interested in. For our purposes, of course, we want a sort of complete picture of the state. So we developed a what's called a sort of web scraping tool to go to the state registry and download all of the property boundaries for the whole state, which then allows us to overlay that with deforestation areas and come up with a sort of list of likely targets for investigation, for case studies that investigators like Chris will use in their published reports. Cattle sales is a similar picture. So if you want to move animals around in Brazil, you need to file a document called an animal transit guide. So this is a sort of thing you file with a state agency, and it shows, it kind of declares who you are as a farmer, gives your tax number and that kind of thing. And it gives the details of the person you're selling the animals to as well. And it gives details of the animals, their sex, their age, and that kind of thing. So this is super useful for us because it allows us to see which farms the big big beef traders, big beef companies are buying from. To get access to these, you need to sort of know the sort of 6-digit code for each document when you search them on a sort of online web portal. But similar to the situation with the property boundaries, we've managed to develop a bit of software that will sort of automatically run through every possible code and download every document in the collection. So for the report we're currently working on, I think we've got just over 3 million documents that we've managed to download for animal transit guide documents. Once you've got them, you can kind of combine them together into a database and do analysis on them in a sort of bird's eye view, which allows you to kind of generate hits that can then be investigated by researchers. So here's a little schematic showing you how it all is brought together. The little folder icon and represents the sort of easily packaged, sort of readily available data like the deforestation data that we get from the Space Agency. Then on the bottom left, we've got the sort of data that we generate through what's called scraping these various websites and kind of putting together our own home-cooked databases of stuff like animal transit guides. That all gets put into a database. In this case, the piece of software is called PostgreSQL. And that database then feeds a sort of visual analysis software package that analysts can use. So I'll give you a little look at that in the next slide. So this is what it looks like, what someone like Chris would see when doing the analysis. So in blue, you've got a ranch boundary. So that's a farm. At the background, you've obviously got satellite imagery. And then in red, you've got areas of potential deforestation. So in this case, you can see there's a sort of crescent-shaped piece of deforestation that overlaps with that ranch. So the analyst sees that and then thinks, okay, well, I need to look into that in more detail, check out what date that deforestation is likely to have occurred, and then compare that to sales that that ranch may have made to beef companies to see whether those companies have violated their anti-deforestation commitments by sourcing beef from that ranch. As well as doing this kind of analysis that sort of hands-on and that the kind of researchers can do manually, we also do a bit more of a sort of, as I was saying before, bird's eye kind of look at the supply chain. So my last slide just has a couple of charts that give you a little sneak preview of what will be in our report next month. The one on the left is a map of the state of Pará, and that shows you sort of the real concentration of where these companies source their cows from. The shape in red is a municipality called São Félix do Xingu. Chris can correct me on my pronunciation there, but that's like the sort of most popular municipality for cattle ranching in Brazil, at least for these companies. And we were able to do this analysis just by looking across the whole set of 3 million GTAs at once. And then on the right, we've got a little bit of analysis showing what types of ranches these companies are sourcing from. So from left to right, you've got really big ranches on the left, so really small ranches on the right. So you can see that a lot of the animals that these companies buy does come from these sort of mega ranches with huge herds of cattle. But quite a significant proportion of the cattle they buy also comes from relatively small ranches. So you end up with a big pool of relatively small suppliers. Now that becomes problematic because the bigger the pool of suppliers, the more risk of deforestation you introduce into your supply chain and the harder it becomes to track. So it's potentially a problematic situation where you've got a massive sort of pool of small suppliers all kind of sending cows now and then to these big companies. So that's just a sort of an overview of what the sort of data that we use. I think I'm keen to emphasize that we kind of like to work in the open, so we're publishing the code we use for this analysis. So when the report comes out, you'll be able to click through and find that, and other NGOs and other organizations who might want to kind of perform similar stuff, we'd encourage them to take a look at that. But yeah, back to Julianne.
Great, thank you so much, Louis. That was an incredible behind the scenes look at the different investigative tools that you use to uncover and to track this level of deforestation. And that's essential in proving that it's happening and also tracking the extent of it. So thank you so much for giving us that behind the scenes look. And as you say, this data and access to these different tools are widely available, which is also very encouraging and inspiring for other groups also on the ground who would like to pursue this further and to help bring accountability on this front. The extent of deforestation of climate critical forests is absolutely staggering, as we've seen and heard today, and it's growing. While many attendees today are likely familiar with the perils of deforestation and why we must keep our trees and tropical forests standing, the role of companies and banks is likely surprising for many. So how can this be stopped, and where does accountability lie? Next, we have Joe Blackman, our head of forest policy and advocacy. And Joe is going to tell us a bit about the different global measures that can be put into place to prevent global finance from funneling billions into projects that destroy tropical forests. Joe, thank you for joining us today. Can you please tell us what needs to happen for banks and companies to stop bankrolling deforestation projects?
Thanks, Julianne. Hi, and hi everyone on the call today. So as we've heard about these companies in Papua New Guinea and Brazil from Leila and from Chris and Louis as well, that are raising forests to make money from palm oil, beef and rubber, they're able to secure financing at commercially attractive rates from banking hubs in the US, Europe and Asia. And this is very typical of the deforestation sector. Indeed, Global Witness has investigated the financing of 6 huge agribusiness, 3 operating in the Amazon, 2 in the Congo Basin and 1 in Papua New Guinea. We discovered that between 2013 and 2019, they were backed to the tune of $44 billion by over 300 investment firms, banks and pension funds headquartered across the globe. Over the last decade, many financial institutions have committed to tackling deforestation, so often associated with human rights or corruption. But there remains little transparency and accountability over how banks put these commitments into practice. And meanwhile, the world's largest financial institutions continue to sink vast sums into companies, either levelling forests themselves or via other companies, often in blatant violation of their own deforestation policies and public commitments. Our investigation revealed how some of the largest names in global finance, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Santander and Standard Chartered among them, provide tens of billions of dollars in financing between 2013 and 2019 to companies either directly or indirectly deforesting the largest rainforests in the world. Leading investment firms, including JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America and Morgan Stanley are also implicated. And this only scratches the surface of a global systems failure. And it's not just Global Witness that's found startling evidence of the financing linked to deforestation by well-known financial institutions. A collaboration of NGOs, including Rainforest Action Network and Amazon Watch, recently published the forest and finance data, showing that since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015, global banks have funneled a staggering $154 billion in loans and underwriting into the production and trade of forest risk commodities, so often associated with deforestation and land degradation in the 3 major tropical forest regions in Southeast Asia, Brazil, and Central and West Africa. And what we see time and time again is when banks and investors' links to deforestation are exposed, they do one of several things, and sometimes all at once. They claim it's not their responsibility. They hide behind client confidentiality. That's essentially banks choosing to lend millions of dollars to high-risk companies without even making a basic condition of the loan that they can confirm the company is a client of the bank. And they develop or point to policies they have on deforestation. What they don't do is hand over the profits they made from these deals to affected communities. And what they don't do is clean up their act. As we see many examples of banks with a pattern of backing problematic companies and continuing to invest in forest risk commodities. They keep the money and they move on. And this is really the core of the problem. Banks and investors can make money from deforestation, but don't seem to ever lose money. Those who pay the real costs are the indigenous people and local communities who've lost their forest livelihood and important cultural sites. and ultimately all of us who lose out through the loss of these climate critical forests, through the loss of the carbon sinks, their global cooling function, the biodiversity loss. And as we've been made aware of more recently, this can pose severe threats to human health as habitat loss increases the risk of global pandemics like COVID-19, providing fertile ground for zoonotic diseases that pass from animals to humans as habitat is destroyed. So as long as the rules are rigged so that companies and financial institutions don't pay the cost of the environmental destruction, bank and investor promises to do better next time will mean very little. So what do we do with this massive market failure to curb global deforestation? Well, this is where we think governments need to step in. We're calling for governments that are home to the financial capitals of the world to take action to end the complicity of global finance in deforestation and forest-related human rights abuses. Recognising the failure of voluntary initiatives and bank policies only overseen by the banks themselves, we believe it's time for governments to legislate to stop financial institutions from ploughing money into companies associated with deforestation. We believe that they should require these institutions by law to assess the deforestation risk of the companies they back, and then to take action to mitigate, prevent, and report on those risks. Legislation has just been published in the UK to stop companies using products associated with illegal deforestation. We want this to cover all deforestation and also to apply to finance. The EU is currently considering similar laws that would also apply across all EU countries. Just over 1 million people have backed a call for these new laws to also cover finance. So we know it's possible, and we know the public support is there. If a bank really wants to show it cares about deforestation, then now is the time to publicly join calls for new laws to cover finance to create fairer markets. As we hopefully start to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to rebuild our economies, supply chains, and finance on a sustainable and resilient footing by backing deforestation-free laws for companies and finance.
Great. Thank you so much, Jo, for that in-depth background and really driving home the importance of the role that governments can play in legislating and really stepping up to ensure financial institutions aren't able to funnel billions into companies associated with deforestation. And as we've heard from your remarks, this is especially urgent as the world is facing an increasingly deadly pandemic with COVID, and the data and the science that points to the link between habitat loss and deforestation and these zoonotic diseases that will lead to more pandemics in the future. So this is a very urgent and timely issue. It's also really reassuring to hear that there's movement in the EU and in the UK on the legislation front, and hopefully that can serve as a model for other countries around the world and some of the other major players. So before we get to questions from the audience, I have one more question for Jo. So this is hopefully something that is more inspiring and invigorating because, you know, we've heard some very heavy and difficult information today on the scope of deforestation in the world and the role that that plays in worsening climate change. So my final question for Jo is, can you tell us what we as individuals present here today can do to put pressure on governments and companies?
Thanks, Julianne. Well, as you said, there are some really encouraging signs that governments are willing to legislate in this area. And I think the fact that both the EU and UK are considering this provides a really crucial opportunity to push for these laws to cover finance. And we know that public pressure can really make a massive difference on this. So yeah, we do have some specific actions that people can take. For those listening today in the UK, you could write to your Member of Parliament and ask them to ensure that finance is covered in the deforestation section of the Environment Bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament. And for those in the EU, well, Global Witness, along with a number of other organisations across the EU, is coordinating a massive mobilisation to try and get as many people as possible to submit their views to the European Commission, and a consultation that is currently underway there. What's really encouraging is this looks set to be one of the most popular consultations ever undertaken by the EU, with over 1 million people having already added their voice to calls for strong legislation that also includes the finance sector. And we do have a link on our website, which I can share shortly in the chat, which gives details of how you could add your name. So yeah, I think those are both two clear really examples of ways that we believe people can really make a difference and try and ensure that the policymakers are listening to the public concern and taking action to tackle global deforestation.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. That's very promising and very exciting. And we will be sharing links so you can learn more about that and how you can get involved. So now we're going to go to the question for the audience for questions. And part of the Countdown TED series ethos is really to encourage participation from different audiences around the world. So we have a lot of questions streaming in right now. So thank you so much for that, and keep them coming just in the Q&A box. So the first question we have is for Joe again. So Joe, it's great to hear about progress in the EU and UK towards legislation targeting the role of companies in deforestation. What is happening in the US, and how could the US election outcome change the game for US policy?
Thanks, Julianne. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think I guess we hope that the recent political changes in the US will really help pave the way for legislative action to tackle deforestation, similar to the developments we're seeing in the EU and UK. We're aware already of interest from a couple of senators in taking forward draft legislation on this agenda. We also know that climate change has been top of the list for many of Biden's calls with world leaders, and he's also made some really encouraging commitments on funds to tackle deforestation of the Amazon. So we really hope the new administration will prioritise concrete action to tackle financing of deforestation by US-based financiers, and we really look forward to working with them on this agenda.
Great, thank you. And we have a couple of questions for Chris next. So the first question, what can we as consumers do to put pressure on Brazil or meat companies to ensure that cattle farms don't lead to more deforestation?
Yeah, thanks, Julianne. Yes, well, as Louis and Joe and Lida rightly pointed out, I think some of the best things that consumers can do in relation to this issue is to, for example, if they have a particular account in a major bank, multinational bank, be that European or American bank, that they know is financing some of the beef companies that we've identified in our report Money to Burn and will elaborate more on in upcoming investigations, they can take to task, right, their particular banks to make sure that they're not financing the beef companies that we and others expose for large-scale deforestation. They can also ensure that, when they're, for example, going to buy those products that relate to beef in major supermarkets such as Sainsbury's or Walmart that others have reported on, then, you can make sure that you're not purchasing the beef that relates to those named companies that we have reported on before in the past and others. And that's a fairly simple Google search that you can do now. And also, as Joe rightly mentioned, right, you can petition your own government to make sure that they strengthen or create new existing legislations that, can pressure their home companies to make sure that they screen out all of the deforestation associated with their financial portfolios or also with their commodities. So I think those are some interesting moves that, you as an individual, as a consumer, can do to try and stem the tide of this rising deforestation.
Great, thank you so much. And that actually answers a bit of the second question that you got. So what is the alternative when demand for meat or beef is so high? Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are quite a few alternatives. Brazilian civil society and others have also written about how when Brazil successfully reduced its deforestation by 80% between 2004 and 2014, paradoxically, they managed to increase beef production. Unfortunately, that's not the case now. Deforestation is rising again, and beef production is also rising. So one of the proposed solutions, for example, is to use already degraded land in areas that are not forested in Brazil, especially moving away from the Amazon. There's apparently 64 million hectares of degraded land which could be apt for pasture. There's also a whole movement to try and intensify the rotation of cattle in existing land areas so that you don't have to expand into forests by, increasing investment in production. And of course, there's also, in the interim, that could help reduce the associated deforestation that's linked to that. But ultimately, the long term, with rising demand for beef in places like China and a growing middle class, I think we will need to move away from a model of consumption of meat. And that's where, hopefully new technologies that relate to the production of lab-grown beef can start to steer away from the traditional use of land from the livestock industries and towards those new technologies that we as consumers can hopefully opt to choose from and which can be produced locally. But I think, as Joe said, that the crucial alternative is to make sure that the consumers markets of those beef companies legislate to make sure that their companies exclude deforestation from their supply chains. And that will send a very clear signal to companies operating in Brazil and to the Brazilian government that the world is not accepting commodities linked to this deforestation.
Thank you so much, Chris. That is super insightful and helps to ground us in some real solutions that consumers can also take on. And that is very reassuring that we also have a role to play in all of this. So the next question that we have is for Leela. Where do most of the logs from Papua New Guinea end up? And what pressure can be leveraged to decrease this massive level of deforestation?
Yeah, thanks, Julianne. I think it probably will not surprise many folks in the audience to learn that China is by far the biggest customer of Papua New Guinea's timber exports. Papua New Guinea actually exports more tropical logs than any other country on Earth. So it's a huge trade, it's very profitable. And actually our work and others suggests that the vast majority of this timber is illegal, often because the companies have violated land rights of local community members like Anthony. And China has actually moved to make it illegal for its own companies to use illegal timber. And there's a process happening right now with revisions to the country's forest law that could extend this to include timber from overseas. And of course, that would impact the timber trade with Papua New Guinea. Organizations we've worked with in country, including the Papua New Guinea Council of Churches, are strongly supportive of this, and we've worked with them to help them communicate their platform or their position on this to Chinese policymakers. But I think what's going to be really increasingly important as well now and in the coming years is who buys those actual agricultural commodities that are produced in Papua New Guinea by clearing forests, by deforestation, and who is financing those. No one should be profiting from deforestation, and much less that associated with the kind of human rights abuses that we're seeing on the ground in Papua New Guinea. So in terms of pressure points, I think we've seen some really amazingly impressive work this year, pushing financiers to drop fossil fuels from their portfolios. And I hope we're going to see that movement grow to include other climate risk industries like deforestation, agriculture, and you heard more detail on that from Joe.
Great, thank you, Leela. So next we have a question for Louis. So we would love to hear more about other uses of data and investigative methods outlined in the different areas of Global Witness's work. So if you could just talk us through some other uses of data and investigative methods, that would be great.
Sure, happy to, yeah. So yeah, at Global Witness, we have a 2-person data team at the moment, me and my boss, Sam Leon. Soon to become 3 people. We're hiring a new person who's coming on in January. And yeah, we really try and work across all areas of Global Witness's campaigns. I mean, some are more amenable to data-driven analysis than others, obviously. I think the forest stuff is one of the best examples of an area where there just is a lot of data out there that can be of use and that could be combined in useful ways. But just to give a few examples of other stuff we've worked on recently, yeah, my colleague Sam did a piece just after the US election on using the Facebook ad library, which is a collection of all the ads that are shown on Facebook, and they're accessible programmatically through a sort of interface where you can download details of them, when they were shown, how much money was spent on them, that kind of thing. And so we use this to track ads shown, ads promoted by Biden and ads promoted by Trump, and through a bit of aggregate analysis found that Trump's ads were more closely targeted, or targeted to smaller groups of people than Biden's on the whole. So this feeds into our new campaign on digital threats to democracy. We're campaigning to have micro-targeting of political adverts banned. So that was an interesting sort of blog post exploring that. I guess another example of a recent thing, I think it was a few months ago now, was a piece of work we did using leaked data from a bank on the Isle of Man. So this bank had been hacked back in 2019, and all its sort of account details and internal data was leaked on the internet. So we sort of dug through that. You know, it's all these sort of big images of hard drives and you know, people on sort of bank accounts and things. Dug through that to find interesting examples of potential tax evasion. And we did a story looking at how billionaires register their private jets in the Isle of Man and use a sort of tax loophole to avoid paying VAT. And so that required a lot of data analysis and sort of data exploration skills to kind of go through that and to analyze that data. But yeah, as I say, we really try and work across all areas. We do a lot of web scraping, similar to what I was describing in relation to the Brazil stuff. So kind of creating data sets using unstructured data off the internet, but kind of grabbing that and putting it into a structured form that we can then use. But yeah, hopefully that's a sort of a rough overview of what we do.
Thank you so much. And yeah, there have also been some comments submitted of attendees who are interested in seeing some of the coding and data that you referenced earlier. So we can also share that in a follow-up email to all attendees. So we'll share relevant links. And then, as Louis said, just stay tuned and keep an eye on our website for upcoming reports where we'll be making this data public. So the next question, I would say, is probably best for Leela and Chris, but anyone definitely feel free to step in as well. So the question is, what do Global Witness do to help people like Anthony who are suffering? And before we move on to this question, I just wanted to highlight for those who might be unfamiliar, Global Witness releases an annual report that tracks the killings of environmental activists around the world. And typically we find that each year is deadlier than the last, with about 3 to 4 environmental and land defenders being killed each week for standing up to protect their homes, our forests, our planet, our climate. And it is a big and a crucial campaign that Global Witness is working on, and we actively seek to partner up with people on the ground in order to ensure that these activists have a voice and can be protected. So Leela, it would be great to hear about your experiences on this topic.
Sure, happy to, and thanks to whoever submitted this question. I would say this is, you know, something we grapple with kind of all the time, and when I have been to Papua New Guinea, in meeting with folks like Anthony, other people whose voices we want to hear and whose stories we want to feature in our reporting, excuse me, this is kind of the first conversation we have. You know, we have to explain that we're not a development organization like some groups they may have come into contact with. We can't do direct aid. What we can do is, with their informed consent, bring their voices to a different audience, get their stories out in front of, you know, a global audience, and people hear and appreciate that. I think, you know, we've heard every time we have a meeting with, you know, a village, say, who's dealing with illegal logging, and when we've asked, you know, are you happy to have your stories told, your faces and names printed, despite the risk that this may pose to you, generally we get an overwhelmingly positive response, because folks, especially in very rural, remote communities, feel that their voices are simply not being heard by their own politicians, certainly not by the companies that are profiting from their land and resources, or from, you know, even larger companies down the supply chain who are using that timber, that palm oil, et cetera. And so I really wish we could do more, you know, to help directly. There's a really personal angle there. But our role in this kind of ecosystem is to take those stories and make sure that they get out.
Great, thank you, Leela. Did anyone else want to add to that? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. So the next question, infrastructure, especially roads, are a major driver of climate change and clearly linked to export of commodities. From what you're finding, is infrastructure driving commodity expansion or vice versa, or does this differ across different geographies? Especially thinking about the Amazon and Indonesia, there are major infrastructure expansion plans explicitly for enhancing trade. Leela, Chris, Louis, even, or do you have anything to respond to that question?
Yep, sure. Maybe I'll start, Louis and Leela. Yes, I mean, in relation to the Amazon, obviously all the cattle ranches that you saw on Louis' slides require roads in order to transport, the cattle from the ranches to the beef traders. Often these roads, there's a very famous road in Brazil called the BR-163, which just, cuts right across the Amazon. Often these roads are pre-planned, government programs that have substantial input from major agricultural producers or major cattle ranching federations, and which include also, subsidies from the Brazilian government to enable this to happen. And of course, there's a lot of information out there about how once a road is built, the deforestation increases substantially either side of it, and often then, proliferates and gets worse over the years. And so I think that, the devastation that's been happening in Brazil over the last 20 years with, the Amazon suffering, a rate of deforestation that has lost, countries of forests is enabled specifically by the infrastructure that the
Oh, I think we temporarily lost Chris. Did anyone else want to chime in? We'll see if we can get him back.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address this question. And thanks, Laura, for asking it. This is a particularly tricky one and I'll speak to Papua New Guinea again because that's my area of focus. But what we've seen time and again is that very isolated communities really desperately need roads to get their commodities to market, like their garden produce, to be able to get to schools, to hospitals. So there's a real need. At the same time, as you say, I mean, once you've got that road, that opens up the forest for all kinds of exploitation. And I think the issue there is that the government is really falling down on sort of holistic planning that would, protect areas with community support, of course, and buy-in and planning, and not just kind of open everything up to a really chaotic process that we see right now, where, for instance, logging companies are capitalizing on communities' need for roads and using that as kind of leverage to access their resources in return for really poor infrastructure, logging roads that fall apart, for instance, in a couple of years. Looks like we might have Chris back now, so I'm going to turn this back over to him.
Oh, thanks, Leela. No, and just to reiterate your point exactly, it's not just roads, it's also rail lines, right, as well. Huge rail lines in the Amazon are being built to transport, for example, soy or grains that, are linked to deforestation there. And as Leela mentioned, that relates to a certain prioritization of the production of that commodity over and above the conservation of the Amazon. And obviously those two need not necessarily be, exclusive to each other. And so just to reiterate that point, and often, of course, a lot of the roads that we've investigated often cross protected areas or indigenous community lands, and often without their free, prior, and informed consent. For interested parties, very famous case is a road that was being planned to build over an indigenous area in the Bolivian Amazon called Tipnis. And there it was no free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples, and explicitly to build a road that would facilitate the movement of cattle from one state to another and then out to international markets.
Great, thank you so much, Leela and Chris. That is incredibly informative. So we have time for one more question, and this one is for Joe. What do Global Witness think of the British government's new proposed law on illegal deforestation? It seems like a positive move. Were Global Witness involved, and which other governments are leading the way on this?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great and very timely question. So yes, as I mentioned in my speech, the UK government has brought forward draft legislation last week, and I think it's a move that should be welcomed. It has its strong elements, such as it will prohibit the use by companies over a certain size of products that have come from illegal deforestation. And it will also require companies to undertake rigorous checks, so due diligence, to identify and mitigate that risk. It's really important, I think, as well, because it's, as far as I'm aware, one of the first pieces of legislation like that in relation to agricultural commodities. We've seen it, for example, in timber, but not agricultural commodities. It's also important because UK government is hosting a key climate summit next year, the UK COP. And that's really going to be a crucial moment for the UK to show global leadership, and hopefully we will see other governments follow suit as well. I do want to identify that there are some points of weakness as well, which we will be working hard to try and strengthen as the amendment goes through Parliament in the coming weeks and months. Just a couple of those areas include, for example, to ensure that the rights of Indigenous people and local communities are really embedded in the legislation, and we've seen some improvements as the drafting process has been developed in response to organisations like ours raising that. We think it's really important that their rights are respected. We want it to cover, unsurprisingly, financial institutions, which has been a big focus of our campaign and our discussions today, and we think it's a real shame if they're let off the hook. And I think the final thing I want to flag up as well is that it sadly only covers illegal deforestation at the moment, which we know is only half of global deforestation. And illegal deforestation, according to the proposed law, is what is illegal according to local laws in that country. And as Chris has so rightly illustrated, in countries like Brazil, we're seeing a rollback of enforcement of laws and potentially laws as well. So I think that's potentially a loophole and a weak spot if we're relying on the laws in those producer countries to determine what type of deforestation it is okay or not for companies based in the UK to be accepting in their supply chains. But we think it's a good move. It's been introduced. We're going to carry on working with the government and MPs and peers as it goes through, and we hope to see it strengthen on some of those elements. And the other jurisdiction I just want to mention was the European Union, which I mentioned as well, is also considering similar laws, and we're expecting them to come forward with some draft laws in the first half of next year. And yeah, so I think it's fair to say there are some really exciting and interesting developments in this space, and it feels like, you know, next year could be a real crucial opportunity to make a difference globally on this agenda through legislation. So yes, sign up to our email lists and we will keep you posted.
Thank you so much, Jo, for walking us through the legislation in areas that really crucially need to be strengthened. And it's very reassuring to know that Global Witness is on the case to make sure that happens. And as Jo said, please do sign up to our email list, and we will circulate contact information after the event as well. It would be great to have you just stay up to date on the latest and learn about different ways that you can get engaged. So this is all the time we have for today. On behalf of Global Witness, I want to thank everyone for joining this TED Countdown series. Our event is one of many that similar organizations are hosting to turn ideas into action to fight climate change and to protect our planet. Thank you so much to our brilliant panel for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. This kind of passion and commitment is essential for securing real climate solutions. We will close today with a short video from TED about the Countdown series. And the video features Chris Anderson, who's the head of TED, and entrepreneur and activist Lindsay Levin. So they will guide you through what the TED series is all about and the movement that they've created.
Welcome to TEDx Countdown. This event is one of more than 500 mainly virtual gatherings taking place over these days and weeks in over 90 countries, all part of Countdown's global launch. But what on earth is Countdown, and what are we hoping to achieve?
Countdown is a massive collaboration to bring together every citizen of planet Earth who wants to do something about the single biggest crisis we face. From wildfires to hurricanes to flooding, Our destabilized climate is already causing terrible damage. But the good news is there are many, many people working with creativity and determination to help us find our way through.
TED has never attempted anything at this scale before. We couldn't have made Countdown happen without the amazing TEDx community, including those who are joining us for the first time. We also couldn't have done it without the incredible partnership with Lindsay's group, Future Stewards, which brings together many people and organizations right at the forefront of the battle against climate change. Honestly, seeing everyone come together to make today possible has been unbelievably exciting and heartwarming.
When we think about the challenge of climate change, two things stand out starkly. One, we've pushed our home, the Earth, to its limits. Two, today's crises are all interconnected. The climate crisis is also a health crisis because of the dirty air and polluted water that sickens or kills millions of people every year. It's a crisis of equity, justice, and livelihoods, with the most vulnerable being the most affected. And it's a crisis of purpose and meaning.
Our goal is that all of us will walk away with a clear picture of what it will take to tackle this terrifying problem. Because although it's really complicated, there's actually a simple way to think about it. We, Earth citizens, have to stop sending greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we have to figure out ways of reabsorbing the excess emissions that are already up there. Picture it this way. Our beautiful planet is being overheated by a pollution blanket of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. When you zoom in, that pollution is coming from 5 major sectors: energy, transport, industry, food, and our misuse of nature. Scientists agree that we have to cut our emissions in half in the next 10 years. That's what Countdown means. Count emissions down. And at the same time that we're doing that, we're counting down to a clean, beautiful, exciting future.
What excites me most about Countdown is the chance to invite people everywhere to ask the same question. How can we make a difference? To discover that instead of feeling hopeless and helpless, we can actually do this. Yes, it's urgent. Yes, it's serious. But there's real momentum underway, not spoken about nearly enough. We are poised on the edge of a revolution in innovation and job creation. This is an amazing moment because we all get to decide. What do we stand for? Do we love ourselves and our home enough to preserve it for the future? I believe we do. It's at once a burden and a sacred privilege, and it's ours to do.
If you'll commit this time, we think this is a day you could remember for the rest of your lives. Thank you so much for being part of it. And so, let the countdown begin.
Thank you to TED for giving us this fantastic opportunity today. As we just heard Lindsay Levin ask, what do we stand for? Do we love ourselves and our home enough to preserve it for the future? Thank you for joining us today and for taking a stand to protect our climate and our future. You can learn more about the TED Countdown series and the lead up to COP and the various events at countdown.ted.com. Thanks again, and on behalf of Global Witness, we're very honored to have your presence today with us and hope to see you soon.